Hey everyone, this is Cami Westall with a general summary and overview of Chapter 3. There's a lot of meat in this chapter after the first two had been a little bit more general. And it starts off stressing the importance of geography, that we have moved over from the Middle East area in the previous chapters, now here with the Minoans to the island of Crete. The Minoan civilization, an interesting one. If you're familiar with the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull, that's from the Minoan culture, this creature that ate children every once in a while. Good old happy times there. They had to hide them in a labyrinth, and so these labyrinths that are sort of internal mazes and buildings, that comes from the Minoan civilization as well. And something happens around 1450 BC, as it mentions on page 63. Seems like a natural disaster. Nova on PBS has a special on that you can watch if you like the science behind that and whether it was an earthquake or tsunami. They look at dirt that has been carried to other islands as evidence of that. But whether it was a natural disaster, which seems pretty likely, or not, when their culture is weakened, the Mycenaeans step in. The Mycenaeans are based a little bit more up where the mouse is moving, and they'll come down to Crete. Talks about the development of their culture, the written script called Linear B. And then they're warlike people, but something happens to them, and their culture kind of disappears, and we get into this period known as the Greek Dark Ages. It's not the same thing as the Dark Ages with castles and peasants and nasty guys on horseback and stuff that we'll get to in the medieval period, but a Greek Dark Ages where a lot of it's in the dark to historians. They just don't know a lot of what happens there. And then by the end of that period, we get the emergence of Homer, whose work some of you are hopefully and probably familiar with, the Iliad and the Odyssey, about this Trojan War that they used to think was purely mythological, but now there's good evidence that was a war that did happen to some extreme, that got started when Paris kidnapped Helen, and it starts this big conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans. In one of the Monty Python movies, you have the Trojan rabbit instead of the Trojan horse that was used in that conflict. If you've seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's based on the Odyssey with a man named Odysseus trying to get back home. George Clooney's character in that movie is Ulysses, which is the Latin name for Odysseus. He's trying to get back home to his wife Penny, who in Homer's work is Penelope. So works that the Greeks took great pride in, and if you're complaining about how much you need to know for this test, keep in mind that Greek students had to have the Odyssey and the Iliad memorized, so you have much less work to do than they had to do there. But it then goes on about his enduring legacy and the excellence that is expected of Greeks and the pride that they take in their culture and their history. Then talks more about the structure of Greek civilization with the polis. The plural forms Poleis, polis. The polis is kind of this city-state idea that some of these are going to be huge and some are itty-bitty. But you've kind of got a surrounding countryside area, the Acropolis, that hilltop area that lots of Greek restaurants will be named after, the agora, the open market space, and things that these polis you see had in common with one another. So common places for gathering, for worshipping their gods, for defense of the polis up on the Acropolis. Common troop formation with the hoplites, the Greek infantrymen who had to be really strong because they were carrying a lot of bronze, these bronze round shields, bronze helmets, bronze breastplates there, They've got shin guards on their legs, spear about 9 feet long, as it mentions on page 68. It was very important for those phalanxes to maintain their order, but these hoplites would defend the Greek polis in their way of life. Discusses the colonization, and that can have some negative consequences on others, but it spreads this Greek influence to other places in the area. It leads to more trade, but again, it gives the example of Corinth, which was a not so happy example for people who struggled under tyranny. So Corinth, one of the famous polis there. Sparta, another one that became well known because of that movie 300 that came out a few years ago, that I refused to watch because I don't think I could handle the blood, or the fake blood. But the Spartans, these were very, very militaristic people. It mentions the helots who were there. People are concerned about an uprising that could occur, and so men were then required to be in the army for the vast majority of their lives. They talks about the delicious meal on page 72 that they ate, the pork boiled in blood and salt. Don't know why Cracker Barrel doesn't have that as their Sunday special instead of fried chicken. But everything was designed to be strong. If they thought children were unfit, they dropped them off of a cliff. The women were encouraged to work out, which gives them, since their men are all fighting in the army and living in barracks, they do have some more freedom there. They're kind of in charge of running the community. But the Spartans were a very unique culture. The women had to encourage the men to go to war. Those who were viewed as chickens or weak were badly mistreated or were mocked. So very, very militant people there in Sparta. And it doesn't have the tyrant so much as an oligarchy with different kings trying to rule and maintain power. Athens, the largest of the polis, is very, very different. Talks about some of the development of its government reforms, eventually getting to Cleisthenes and the development in Athens of this council of 500. And so those assemblies are there, and then from that point they would select a governing council by lot, which was completely random. And so it's considered to be the birth of democracy, meaning power to the people, as explained on page 75 there in Athens. So the polis is still in charge. People don't have a lot of individual rights, but they are more involved in Athens with the development of democracy in the political process. Then goes on to discuss Greek culture, which is obviously very famous, but they have conflicts going on as well. The Persian Wars that occur from 499, this particular map says 500, but really the conflicts start in about 499 BC to 479 BC, and there are two major phases here that occur. The first has several key battles that occur, and it's largely dealing with this area where the mouse is moving over Ionia, and whether these Greek polis will be under Persian influence or not. But you have the Persian leader Xerxes, who will send troops over to the Greek area. The first phase is where the Battle of Marathon occurs, that became famous because when the Persians were defeated at that battle and went home, someone supposedly ran about 26 miles to Athens to announce the victory, and he collapsed and he died. That account is probably not historically accurate because it wasn't written until a couple hundred years after the battle actually occurred, but the 26.2 mile marathon does have its historical origins, at least in legend, from that battle in the Persian Wars. So the Persians kind of limp home, then they come back. You've got the famous battle at Thermopylae. That's the one that was the in the movie The 300, about the Spartans and how heroic they were under the leadership of their king Leonidas. Basically, all of the Greeks who were fighting together, all of these different polis, they had to separate forces because someone told the invading Persians who are marching down the road, someone told them about a kind of a secret road off to the side. So it's not only 300 Spartans who are left to fight there at Thermopylae, but there are a couple of thousand other Greeks who are there with them. But the famous line that is mentioned on page 79, when the Persians said that their arrows would darken the sky in battle, one Spartan warrior supposedly responded, "That's good news. We will fight in the shade." But the Leonidas and his allies, so again, it's not just 300 Spartans fighting there by themselves, but they are outnumbered and they do die despite their heroic stance. The Persians then march down a little bit farther, but they'll be defeated at Salamis, and then they'll kind of limp home again after that. So things seem good. Athens will get very strong after this, and too strong for comfort. Similar to how, if you've studied U.S. history in a way, you've got all of these colonies that unite together in the American Revolution for their independence, and they prove they can fight together, and they win, but then the Civil War happens less than 100 years later, and differences start to be drawn out, and these differences start to occur. Athens had kind of been just as the United States fell apart and there was disarray, the polis that united together against a common enemy now are going to be opposed to one another. Athens had ended up taking a lot of money from the Delion League that's mentioned, and then that leads to the Peloponnesian War that it discusses beginning on page 83. Basically a civil war in Greece primarily between Athens and its allies on one side, Sparta and its allies on the other. Sparta technically wins, but it results in problems all the way around, not so much for the culture, but because there was still a lack of unity on all parts. And see the map of the area where that occurred, and Sparta and its allies in red, Athens and its allies in brown there. And it's going to, with a weakened society, with groups still not getting along, it will lead to an opening for someone who is strong to come in, and we'll see that in chapter 4. Talks about the development of history through Thucydides, considered one of the he and Herodotus, the first real historians there in Greece. The development of drama, Euripides, Sophocles, comedy from the Greeks, that they had these entertainment values. The classical ideal, and those ideals that would be copied by later societies. It mentions the Parthenon, which is the most copied building in history. It's not extravagant, doesn't have a lot of extra stuff, but it's kind of that classical architecture. And this was built in a very short period of time, only about 8 or 9 years, during the time of Pericles that it talks about before. Then it gets into the famous Greek philosophy, beginning on page 90. The Sophists, these teachers of rhetoric. Rhetoric meaning they're not necessarily buying what they tell you. it's just persuasive persuasive speeches and speech making. Some of you may have had public speaking in classes where you were asked what your view is on abortion or gambling or something potentially controversial like that, and then you're asked to take the opposite side. That's rhetoric, making those persuasive speeches, and so they're paid for that. So they don't really care. They're not out because they're so committed to their cause. And one person who really challenges them is going to be Socrates and the famous Socratic method, also, as it says on page 90, but also known as the dialectic method, using those questions and answers. He doesn't want to lecture people. He wants them to figure things out on their own. And he teaches for free. That's not his full-time job. And so he'll go up to people and try to get to the root of the issue. He always kind of maintains the upper hand in conversation, but wants people to figure things out for themselves and question things. He famously says that the unexamined life is not worth living. And so that's going to get him in trouble, because you can imagine today, even with teenagers taking a defiant stance and questioning what their parents are doing, and that doesn't always go over well when young people try to ask questions and their elders say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, you have to listen to me because I've lived it. Well, Socrates is going to be charged with corrupting the youth of Athens, and he will be put on trial in 399 BC. Remember, years are going backwards. And he will be executed. He has to drink poisoned hemlock. And this is a painting drawn much later of Socrates, who, based on the accounts of his death that were written by his student Plato, seated here. You can see all of his followers are upset. They can't even watch handing him the poisoned hemlock. Socrates, who never saw him in person, but I can say with a good amount of confidence he probably did not have six-pack abs. But Socrates is still there teaching. He says for him, death is either going to be like nothing or it's going to be an exciting new world. He still has no problem accepting his fate and leaves a historical legacy there. As I mentioned, his famous student is Plato. All of Socrates' words were written down by Plato. Famously writes the Republic, and talks about how there are ideal forms in the world, these ideal ideas. So, for example, well, that's an even worse example. Hang on, I'm trying to draw a circle. Okay, I can say this is a circle, and maybe it's recognizable as a circle. Plato would come along with his ideal form and say that is not a circle. A circle, by definition, has an equal radius from the center on all sides. Yours is shorter here, it's longer over here, it's got this little meeting point here. That is not a circle. A real circle meets that definition. That would be a real circle. So you have an ideal, kind of these ideal forms, and that's what Plato is addressing, to say in life we need to strive for the ideal. We have ideas of what we know is best. We're copying these things, they're not good. And so he says in the ideal government, the best way to have a government would be to have the philosopher kings, people who have wisdom, the philosophy, and they're kings. They have good ruling abilities, political power. That would be the ideal type of ruler. The ideal form of a ruler would be the philosopher kings. It goes on to talk about Aristotle, some of the different Greek religions, the importance of the gods in that society, the family there. So some of the other characteristics of a culture that is still celebrated in a lot of ways, and for good reason. So that sums up chapter 3.